All right, how's everyone doing today? We are diving into some new content, a little bit of uncharted territory here, as I'll admit that I got sent down a rabbit hole when I was listening the other day to the podcast that Rogan did with Terrence Howard and Eric Weinstein. And as chaotic and interesting as that whole conversation was, there was one thing that Eric said that completely caught me off guard and basically instantly blew my mind if it were to be true. And I don't remember what the exact quote was that he said during the podcast, but I think it was something along the lines of Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert, was in the academic publication business, and through the course of his career actually monopolized scientific journals and created a barrier of entry for scientists outside of the uh, core sphere, so to speak, which effectively restricted new information and scientific innovation that emerges on like the corners or the fringes or from the smaller, more local scientific communities. And I was like, that's a very absurd statement, and I instantly wanted to figure out if I could gauge whether that's true or not. And obviously, I'm not credentialed to analyze anything having to do with academia or scientific research journals. I don't have the knowledge or the capacity to tell what's right or wrong. But one thing I can do is look at whether or not there is something like an incentive structure within the industry that might have really, really big, unknown, or otherwise hidden unintended consequences for the rest of us and for the rest of the scientific community and scientific knowledge as a whole, which everyone is increasingly having access to. So, in researching this, I came across a couple very interesting pieces of information. Right here is right here is an article in the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine, and it's called "The Highly Profitable but Unethical Business of Publishing Medical Research." And we won't read the whole thing, but before, just some background on Robert Maxwell, who is Ghislaine Maxwell's father and who Eric was making that claim about. Uh, Turns out he was a notorious British business mogul, born in the 1920s or 30s, and he started off and he grew his business through publishing scientific journals. And over time, his business was a little bit cyclical. It went up and down. He got into some bad debt, shady business dealings, it sounds like. And through his career, he eventually acquired control of the country's leading printing company, scientific publishing industry, and what some might say a monopoly under the umbrella of these massive consolidated publishers. And one really interesting thing that I read was a phrase that Maxwell used when he essentially discovered the profit margins, specifically within the scientific and the medical publishing industry. What he called it was a perpetual financing machine. And what he realized is that he could utilize people's resources, knowledge, and labor for a almost exploitative cost through monopolizing these publications and creating barriers of entry around the established journals so that unwanted, unnecessary, unprofitable, or otherwise new information that might emerge on the fringe or in smaller local scientific communities, they haven't complete control over what is allowed inside that consolidated bubble. And it's really hard to realize the mechanics of how a structure like that might deeply affect the information that actually works its way into the main discourse of the scientific community. And again, I'm like, as someone who certainly isn't qualified to analyze the research itself, what you can say and what anyone who looks at information like this can say is that a top-down control of information in this way will have direct and indirect impacts on the critical mass of scientific information, which drives an innumerable amount of things in the world, as we said, medicine, physics, astrology, space, scientific engineering. This information is what grounds these scientific institutions and what allows new innovations to be made in every facet of the world, essentially. And especially when it comes to academia and the information that leaks into academia from a source, from a primary source, which essentially are these publications. The picture that paints of what drives the scientific research process is really called into question. And I'm hesitant to make and point out claims like this that have such big implications, but I mean, I can't get away from the small bit of information I read already being deeply implicative of something at least monopolistic, but at worst, a malicious top down control of information which affects countless amounts of people. And another thing worth noting is, well, this guy Robert, he sounds like he jumped off his boat in the middle of the ocean, committed suicide because he got into some bad business dealings. Towards the end of his career, he had accumulated a lot of debt. So the report was that's what happened. But before that, he sold his company to, I believe it was Elsevier, and or Elsevier. I'm not sure how exactly it's pronounced. But the thing worth noting is that that company, in addition to its rivals who have adapted within a competitive industry, have maintained that perpetual financing model because of what it allows them to do, and because they understand where the profit margins are. And unfortunately, the profit incentives are not always going to be aligned with new information, especially disruptive information. And in science, I thought that was a pretty important thing: disruption and deduction and challenging of ideas and the challenging of the status quo and perpetually evolving our understanding of the world around us through this process that we call science. But the act of restricting information in this way, it couldn't be further from that philosophy or what science truly is and should be. So it's kind of disheartening to see and read this information knowing what it could mean. And I will say it's there's not a lot of it. I found a few articles here, but there's not a lot of real analysis on this specific case with Robert Maxwell. And as far as I know, Eric is the only person that I've heard mention it. But if it's true, like I said, is it's absolutely mind blowing stuff because, well, I don't know the age of my audience, but anyone who was in school within the past 20, 30 years, I'd be willing to bet at some point you had a McGraw-Hill textbook. And, well, guess who published and edited McGraw-Hill? Guess who that company belonged to? So kind of reassessing, some of the information and the sources that I learned from and pulled from in my classes, both in high school and college, it just makes you think about the incentives even within these textbooks themselves. Because reading that as a younger person, I always thought that whoever's writing these textbooks must be some omniscient, altruistic, infallible genius. Because why would anyone spend so much time putting this putting this information together for us students to learn? But then as you get older, you understand how it actually works and what things like business and profit incentive are. Not that any of those are bad things, but you start to understand how they can motivate and shape some of the things around you. So looking at all of the academic publications through that lens, even if it doesn't jump into the realm of conspiracy, even if at minimal, it's just a little bit of caution, I think this is another useful thing to be aware of. So, and also I would say if anyone has more information on this specific case or knows more details about how something like this actually works and has played out, I'd be very interested to know. And I'll continue to research what I can, but I thought this was something that would be really good to make a short video on because it's just a tiny piece of information that can change your whole perspective on a certain thing. And there was a lot of information that I was going to point to as well. I had some notes here, but I think that's really enough to give you guys an idea of what kind of my thoughts were when I heard that. But I'll link these articles so you can read them yourself and check out some of the numbers behind these monopolies. But thanks for staying to this point, you guys. I'm kind of all over the place with content, not really honing in on one series, but I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I think we're just going to keep creating and see what happens and see what ends up being useful and what people resonate with. So please subscribe.